themes in the philosophy of perception. I am really glad to introduce Keith Wilson from University of Oslo. His research fields are philosophy of mind and perception, in particular the metaphysics of perceptual experience and the problem of mental representations and the spatial-temporal structure of experience. He wrote some important papers and book chapters about these topics. And the title of today's talk is The Perspectival Character of Experience. I remind to those who want to ask questions during the Q&A to write question in the chat. We will have 45 minutes for the Q&A, and then I'll take note of the right order of the questions. So Keith, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. So hopefully you can see that. Can you see the slide?
Yes, yeah, perfectly.
Good. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Elvira and everyone at Mumble for putting together this wonderful event. I'm really looking forward to hearing all the other talks, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot. So today I'm wanting to talk about the sense in which experience is perspectival. So I don't think it's controversial that we perceive things from a perspective, where that's a kind of spatio-temporal point of view. But in particular, what I want to focus on is the way in which that affects the character of our experience. So the plan, hold on. The plan is, here we go. So first of all, I'll say a bit about what I mean by perspectival character, and drawing on a few characterizations of that in the literature. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume a form of naive realism, which is unusual. Usually people say I'm going to assume representationalism, but I'm going to assume naive realism for today. I think there are problems here for the representationalists as well, and I can talk about those in the Q&A. But in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on how should the naive realist account for the contribution of perceptual perspective to the phenomenal character of experience. So I'll say a little bit about how naive realists have addressed this and why I think this falls somewhat short of capturing the phenomenon. And then I'm going to sketch an alternative, which I call perspectival realism or perspectivalism, which really, in a way, seeks to extend naive realism to allow for perspectival features of experience. But also, I think the view is compatible with forms of representationalism as well. So it's, even if you're not on board with naive realism, I think there's something that could be used here for intentionalists or representationalists too. And then I'll just conclude with a few points. So perspectival character. What do I mean by perspectival character? So the easiest way to do this is just to show you. And so if you imagine you're looking at this scene, obviously you're seeing a picture of it, but if you imagine you're seeing this in 3 dimensions, it's a very mundane picture, deliberately so. This is actually a picture of one of the seminar rooms upstairs here in Oslo. So there are a few features that I want to draw attention to. So we're seeing a bunch of objects and surfaces illuminated in various ways. So for example, the chairs, the 2 chairs there are obviously, I think, the same size chairs, but equally the chair that's pulled up towards the desk there in the front is also the same size and looks to be the same size, even though the image that's forming in our retinas of it is much bigger than the other 2. In fact, the other 2 also differ in size, retinally speaking. There's a white wall, which is illuminated partly by sunlight. So there's one rather strange feature of this scene, which is these shadows which are being cast on the wall from sunlight streaming in through the windows. So you're seeing some shadows of trees. So that's a slightly odd feature. But when you're seeing that in person, it very much looks like you're seeing the yellow sunlight on a white wall. It doesn't look like the wall itself is colored any differently. It looks like a uniformly colored surface. And even outside those shadows, you can see quite a lot of variation in the illumination conditions. So some areas are much brighter than others. but nevertheless, it appears to be a uniformly white wall. So that's also true of other surfaces, like the floor is got a slight texture to it. You can see some shadows on there, but it doesn't look like it has dark patches on the floor. It looks like it's a uniformly colored surface, which is illuminated partly in shadow and partly brighter illumination. So these are all examples of what I think of as perspectival features. There are ways in which our perspective upon the world and perspective upon objects is affecting the character of our experience. They're not properties of the objects themselves, but rather they're relational properties concerning things like our spatiotemporal location and the illumination conditions. So these are perspectival, or what's sometimes called situation-dependent properties. So here's a characterization from E.J. Green and Susanna Schellenberg, where they describe situation-dependent properties as extrinsic, mind-independent properties that are exclusively sensitive to and ontologically dependent on intrinsic properties, so that's the properties of the objects we're perceiving, and situational features. Situational features are features of the environment that determine the way an object is presented. So this is kind of phenomenon that I'm getting at and that I'm interested in. I don't want to entirely agree with Schellenberg's characterization of situation-dependent properties here, and I'm going to use slightly different terminology. But two things I want to take from this quote are, first, that it characterizes these properties correctly, I think, as mind-independent. So they're not strictly dependent on being cognized, but they're mind-independent aspects of the external world, which feature in our perception. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. The second feature is this idea that objects can be presented or perceived in different ways. So again, this is an idea I'm going to pick up on when I sketch my preferred view. We don't just perceive objects, but we perceive them in specific ways. So I just want to introduce a few bits of terminology which will help get things going. So rather than talking about situation dependence, I'm going to talk about perspectival features. And I want to differentiate between two different kinds of things that show up in experience. So first of all, presented elements. So these are worldly items. They could be objects, properties that we experience. So these are things which are presented in experience. And this is true whether you subscribe to naive realism or representationalism. Both views share the idea that there are some parts of the objective world which are presented in experience. I don't want to be particularly prescriptive about what kinds of things can be presented. So it could be that as well as objects and properties, perhaps we perceive events, processes, maybe chemical stuffs in olfaction, maybe absences like silences or holes, and various kinds of ephemera like rainbows, clouds, light, and these kinds of things. So it could be quite a wide category of elements, worldly elements, which are presented in experience. I'm just going to assume there are some such elements, but I won't be prescriptive about what exactly they are. So I want to contrast that with the phenomenal character of experience, or what the experience is subjectively like. So phenomenal character I take to be a property of an experience. So an experience is a mental event. So phenomenal character is properties of mental events. And these are, or they can be, highly situation dependent. So they can vary according to perspective. Also, they could vary according to the individual or the kind of perceiver. So different individuals might see, for example, slightly different colors or be sensitive to different sorts of properties. And typically phenomenal character differs between sensory modalities. So we can have the same presented element. For example, shape could be presented visually, and that kind of experience will have a different phenomenal character to shape being presented tactually through touch. So it could be the same presented shape, but results in different phenomenal character on the basis of the sensory modality. Of course, that's maybe contentious. You might think in the case of shape, even there are two different properties, perhaps a visual shape and a tactile shape, that are being perceived in different modalities. But I'm going to leave that open. So There's a substantive question here about how do we explain the phenomenal character of experience, and different views will characterize that differently. So on a representational view, the phenomenal character supervenes on representational content. On a naive realist view, phenomenal character is to be explained, at least in part, by the elements that are presented. So there might be a relationship between these two kinds of things. But at least we can make this conceptual distinction between stuff in the world that's presented and how it seems to us in experience. Okay, so what about perceptual perspective then? Well, I want to differentiate what I'll call perspectival features, which are situation-dependent elements that show up in perception. So these vary according to where we're perceiving from and contingent environmental factors like lighting conditions, acoustic conditions, and so on. And I'll give a few examples in a second. So perspectival features are typically relational. They're a matter of how the perceiver is related to the environment and the objects in it. And they can vary according to external conditions and one's perspective on the world. So in that sense, they are what I would call observer dependent. They depend on where we're perceiving from, how we're perceiving. But strictly speaking, I don't think they're mind independent because they don't depend on being cognized for their existence. The world is still lit in a particular way, whether or not we're perceiving it as such. And similarly, perceivers can stand in spatial relations to objects, even though they have their eyes closed. So it's not that the spatial relation between the perceiver and the objects depends on being cognized in a way that would make it mind dependent. So they're not purely subjective features. They are objective aspects of the mind independent world and the perceiver's relation to it. So I want to contrast those with non-perspectival features, which are sometimes called intrinsic features of objects. I want to avoid the term intrinsic because I think there's a bit of debate about whether, for example, shape or color is really an intrinsic feature or whether it's really a relational feature. But I'll call these non-perspectival in that these features don't vary according to the perceiver's perspective on them. So these are things like color, shape, size, texture, and so on. So these are both observer and mind independent. So they're features of objects or events that are part of the external mind independent world. And typically these are non-relational. They don't depend on the perceiver's relation to the object. They might, there's a sense in which you might think, well, maybe these are mind dependent or somehow observer dependent. For example, in the case of color, the colors that exist, you might think, depend on the subject's capacity to perceive them. So they're somehow relative to the perceptual capacities that a perceiver has. But nevertheless, what makes it the case that something is red or blue or green is going to be a mind-independent fact about the way the object is in the external world, even if we pick out the particular color property with reference to the perceiver's capacities. So again, I think these are mind-independent features of the world. Color's perhaps a contentious case here, but things like shape and size and texture, you might think are more obviously non-relational. Okay, so that's the terminology I want to sort of set up. So just to give a few examples of perspectival character, here's a nice drawing by Ernst Mach, who tries to capture what things look like from his perspective. So the most obvious perspectival feature is one's spatial perspective and orientation in vision, where we're looking. And vision is very obviously perspectival in this way. Although I would argue this also extends to audition. We hear where we're located in space relative to things. Also in touch and potentially even in taste and smell have a sort of a spatial characteristic in that we sense the way that things are here where we are. So that's one kind of perspectival feature. But there are lots of others. So I've already mentioned lighting conditions, illumination, shadow and shade in vision. Also the presence of intervening media. So if you're looking through a window or a pane of glass or maybe some water which is refracting the image, those are all perspectival features of how one is related to the objects that one is seeing. The acoustic environment is part of our auditory perspective. So the layout, the shape, the size, and some of the material properties in the immediate environment all color the timbre of the sound that we hear. And we can actually hear I think we can hear the space and characteristics of the space on the basis of that. In the case of touch, the presence of clothing, it would be an example of an intervening medium. We can touch things through, we can feel the chair as we sit on it, even though the clothing is in between us and the chair, or the use of prosthetics. So for example, touching something with a stick or using some other device, we can feel how things are at the end of the stick, even though we're not strictly speaking in contact with it. So that would be an example of a tactile perspectival effect. Similar things for taste and smell, like the aspects of the chemical environment, the humidity or the timing of taste and smell signals will affect whether we perceive something as being in the mouth or in the nose. So those are perspectival effects in the chemical senses. And then finally, sensory modality itself is a kind of perspective in the way I'm thinking of it, in that each of our senses gives us a distinctive perspective on the world. One's visual perspective is distinct from our auditory or our tactile perspective, even though these things are related in various interesting ways. So we can think of sense modality itself as being a kind of perspectival feature that shapes our experience. Okay, so I want to kind of group all these together under the term perspectival character. So these are perspectival features which affect the character of our experience. I don't necessarily want to assume that there's anything unifying them metaphysically. They might be very diverse kinds of properties. And I want to leave it open whether we should give a unified treatment of them. Actually, I will argue that we can do this, even if metaphysically they're very different kinds of properties. Okay, so how does this help us? Well, with those distinctions in hand, we can characterize cases of perspectival variation as changes in perspectival features without any corresponding change in non-perspectival features. So an example here would be something like Hume's example of the table. So he's viewing a table which appears in a certain way to him. And when he moves in relation to that table, the image or something seems to change in his experience that suggests a change of size. And Hume uses this to derive the conclusion that we don't directly see the table, but rather we're seeing some kind of image or impression. Now, there's something off, I think, in Hume's characterization of this case, because although the picture you've just seen is a picture of a large table shrinking to a picture of a small table, that's not typically the way we experience things when we see them in real life. So when we're seeing things in 3 dimensions and the relation between the subject and the object changes, we get further away or closer to something. There is a change in our experience, but it doesn't look like the table or the object has changed in size. In most cases, it's pretty obvious to us that our relation to the object has changed, and that's what explains the change in appearance. So I think what's interesting about Hume's example is it's not obviously a case of illusion. In fact, I don't think it's a case of illusion at all, because this is a very prevalent phenomenon that certainly goes throughout visual experience and potentially other sensory modalities as well. But nevertheless, something changes in our experience. There is a change of experience. And the question is then, well, how do we explain that change in phenomenal character if we can't explain it in terms of a change in the non-perspectival properties of the object? So a few things I want to derive from this and other cases. There are a number of phenomenological features about changes in perspective which need to be explained by a theory of perception. So the first is that we do normally differentiate between changes in perspectival and non-perspectival properties. We can tell which kinds of properties are which. So when the table seems to change size, or the appearance changes size in some sense, we take that to be a change in perspective. We don't take it to be a change in the properties of the table. So that suggests that phenomenologically, these two kinds of properties or two kinds of features are differentiated, they're experienced as distinct. In fact, we'd be very surprised if the table itself suddenly changed size. That would be something we wouldn't expect. And we normally can tell the difference between the two. However, we do occasionally get them mixed up. So there are cases where we misattribute or mistake a perspectival feature for a non-perspectival feature. So the classic philosophical example of this is a stick or some other object partially immersed in water, and then it looks supposedly to have a kind of a bent shape. So we have an object which is actually straight, partially immersed in water, and it looks to be bent in some sense of looks. So this is probably not the best picture, but in the kind of lower left part of the image, you can see the slight kind of kink in the shape, which is the bent appearance. There are also a couple of other perspectival effects here. So there's a reflection of the stick, and there's also a shadow. So they're all examples of perspectival features. So this looks like a case where we misperceive or misattribute a perspectival feature, so namely the refractive effect of the water, for a non-perspectival or intrinsic feature of the object, its actual shape. Here's perhaps a more striking example, which was doing the rounds in the media a few months ago. It's an example of the Fata Morgana illusion, which is caused by a layer of cool air above the sea refracting the image of distant objects to make them look as if they're hovering above the surface. So you get this in lots of old tales from sailors talking about floating islands or flying ships and this kind of thing. And it's purely a perspectival illusion. So here, I think it's pretty convincing. If you see that, it really looks like the ship is hovering above the surface of the water, even though we're actually experiencing a refractive effect from in this case, the cold air above the sea. So this shows that we sometimes get confused about which features are perspectival or non-perspectival. But I think even in these cases, it seems to us in experience that for any given property that it's either one or the other. So here we mistakenly think there's a non-perspectival change in location, but actually it's being caused by a perspectival property. So I would argue even in these illusory cases, there's a distinction in the phenomenology between which parts of the scene are perspectival and non-perspectival, even if we get that wrong. So I think that still supports the phenomenological distinction that I want to draw. So the last feature I want to draw your attention to is that we rarely, if ever, experience only perspectival or non-perspectival features on their own. We typically experience them together. So when you see a shape, you see it from some particular perspective, and that perspective affects your experience of it. But we don't only see perspectival shape without seeing the real shape, or vice versa. There may be counterexamples to that, but all I'm claiming is that typically there's a relationship between perspectival and non-perspectival features. So again, this is something I think needs to be explained by theory of perception. Why do we experience them together, and what is the relation between, for example, intrinsic or non-perspectival shape and its perspectival appearance? There's a very tight relationship between those that I think needs to be captured by our theory of perception. Okay, so those are kind of the desiderata that I want to try and explain. And I'm going to, for the moment, I'll put representationalism to one side and focus on the naive realist account of how we do this. So naive realism, I take it, is the view that we are directly presented with external objects and their properties such that we're acquainted with them. So here's a quote from Craig French and Ian Phillips in a recent paper, where they define naive realism as the view that the conscious character of experience in genuine cases of perception, which is to say veridical perception, is constituted, at least in part, by non-representational perceptual relations between subjects and aspects of the mind-independent world. Okay, so again, there's a couple of features of this I just want to highlight. So first of all, it highlights the fact that naive realism is a relational view. It sees experience as a matter of an acquaintance between the subject and mind-independent objects in the world. It also rules out representation as being that kind of, it rules out the perceptual relation as being a representational one. So the idea is we're not appealing to any mental factors like representation, sense data, or anything, but we're just directly acquainted with aspects of the world. The second feature, which I'm actually going to take quite literally from this quote, is the idea that phenomenal character is constituted not only by the external objects and properties that we perceive, but by certain relations between subjects and the objects we perceive. So that my preferred view is going to take that very literally. But normally, naive realists just want to emphasize that phenomenal character of experience is partly constituted by external objects and their properties. They are literally parts of the experience. So we explain phenomenal character in terms of the presented elements. Okay, so how does that help us with perspectival phenomena? Well, I think it's acknowledged by many naive realists that a simple two-place relation between the perceiver and external objects isn't sufficient to account for perspectival variation, because in perspectival variation we have a change in the relation between the perceiver and objects, but there's no change in the object. So when Hume sees the table from a different distance, there's no change in the table, there's no change in the properties of the table that can explain the change in phenomenal character. So instead they appeal to what's sometimes called the third relatum. And this is Campbell and Brewer's view that experience is a three-place relation between the subject, perceptual object or perceptual scene, and the third relatum, which is a spatially located viewpoint or point of view, standpoint, I think Brewer calls it. So the idea here is that all these perspectival variations can be explained by changes in the third relatum. So when the point of view changes or when the illumination condition changes, then that explains the change in phenomenal character, because experience is a three-place relation between that and objects and a subject. So how does that work in specific cases? So I'm going to look at a rather complicated scene here, which is there's quite a lot of different things going on, and try and use this to make some problems for the third relatum view. So this is an image, again, captured on campus here in Oslo. So what you're seeing is looking from outside into a building. They're looking through some glass windows. There's also some items reflected in the windows, so the trees are reflected in the windows. But you can also see inside, and you can see there are these artificial lights which are shining onto the wooden roof. So we have a combination of natural lighting and artificial lighting, and various objects are illuminated in different ways. So how does the third relatum help us to explain the phenomenal character if you're seeing this scene? Well, first of all, it's complicated by the fact that we have more than one spatial point of view, in a sense. We have the physical location of the observer here, which is the subject's point of view, but we also have the reflected image, which in a sense is seen from a different point of view. You're seeing things that are actually behind you. So it's not clear how we're supposed to incorporate that into the view. Do we then have two points of view, or do we have a single point of view which has this kind of complicated reflective element, or maybe the reflection should be accounted for as some kind of illusion of perspective, or illusion of seeing things where they aren't really located. Similarly with there are different ways we can explain this. So one solution might be to say the perceptual relation holds between the subject, a particular object that's being perceived, and a point of view, where the point of view can vary depending on which object it is we're perceiving. So it could be for the tree, we have one spatial point of view on it, but then for the window, we have a different spatial point of view because it's a different object. So in that case, the three-place relation holds on an object-by-object basis. So that works for some of the spatial cases, but once we start to think about illumination conditions, it gets more complicated, because a single object can be illuminated in more than one way, or it can have a variation of illumination across its surface. So if you look at the planks of wood on the roof there, so they're illuminated both by natural sunlight, but also by the artificial colored lights. So here we have multiple illumination conditions across a single object. So again, how do we explain that in terms of the third relatum? Well, we could either divide the object into further parts and say, well, this bit of the object is illuminated by this, so that goes into the point of view for that, and another part has a different point of view with different illumination conditions, but that's going to get very complicated and messy. Another possibility is we just incorporate the illumination of the whole scene into the point of view. So the idea would be that something like the distribution of light across the whole image is part of the point of view. And that might solve some of the problems. But then when we start to think about non-visual modalities, think about auditory experience and tactile experience and so on, if we do the same for all of those, we end up just lumping together a whole bunch of unrelated, sort of metaphysically distinct factors into this third relatum. So the third relatum starts to look less like a kind of unified theoretical posit and more like a grab bag of otherwise unrelated factors. So my worry about the third relatum view is, in a way, it captures spatial perspective quite nicely, because we can think of spatio-temporal perspective on objects. But it doesn't generalize well to multiple modalities. And in fact, it's not really clear it gives us a good explanation of perspectival phenomena at all. All it does is it gives us a label under which to place all the other stuff that affects perspectival character that isn't a matter of the intrinsic properties of objects. So in a way, I think we've just, all Brewer and Campbell have done is they've given a label for the problem, but they've not really given us an explanation of how this gives rise to the kinds of variations in phenomenal character that we actually see. Okay, so much for the third relatum. This isn't supposed to be a knockdown objection. I don't want to claim that this kind of view can't explain the phenomena, just that it needs a lot more elaboration. And in a way, what I'm trying to do is give that elaboration in a way that gives a much finer grained explanation of how different properties enter into the phenomenal character. It's also striking that when Campbell starts to talk about perspectival appearances, and in particular the example of shape, he doesn't actually appeal to the third relatum at all. He gives a totally different kind of explanation. So I'm just going to briefly sketch that out here. So Campbell's view is that perspectival shapes and appearances are a kind of what he calls a mode of presentation of objects. So he argues that in order to make a difference to how we attend to objects or how we act on objects, their perceptual qualities must be manifest to us in experience. So they must show up in phenomenal character. So in order for us to behave differently to different colored objects, those colors must make a difference to the phenomenal character of experience in order for us to be aware of them at all. And he thinks that that allows us to then single out the object from its background. So if we see a red object, the red phenomenal character is what allows us to kind of get a handle on that thing as having distinct boundaries and being separated from a background. So that gives rise to what he calls a mode of presentation, which is a subjective state of the subject that enables the object to be selected for conscious awareness. So he uses this account from Huang and Pashler, where they describe the construction of Boolean maps. So it's like across the whole visual space, a feature will allow you to home in on a particular region, and then you can single that out as a visual object for consciousness and for action. So perspectival shapes on Campbell's account are distinct modes of presentation. They're variations in the subject. They're part of the neural processing that goes on to allow us to single out objects from the background. So I think that's striking for a couple of reasons. So first of all, Campbell is giving a naive realist account. He wants to account for at least part of phenomenal character in terms of the properties of the mind-independent properties of things in the world, but his account of perspectival shape is appealing to properties of the subject. He's appealing to perceptual processing and subjective modes of presentation. Now, what Campbell wants to do is he wants to actually tie the two together. So he wants to say the mode of presentation, so for example, a red mode of presentation, is identical to, it just is the redness of the external object. He wants to say that the two are one and the same thing. Now that might work for red. In fact, I think it's problematic even in the color case, but it doesn't work for perspectival shape, because when we see shapes from different perspectives, they're variable. You know, seeing a circle at an angle looks elliptical, and that elliptical look can't be identical with the circularity, because it looks very different to a circle seen face on. So perspectival features are precisely ones where the mode of presentation varies, even though the external, the property of the external thing stays the same. So I think this identity claim that Campbell makes can't be right. And in fact, he himself says on this approach, the mode of presentation, which, for example, in the case of shape would be the perspectival appearance, is an aspect of the subject's conscious experience. It will affect the causal role of the subject's demonstrative thought. So here he's saying these are purely subjective aspects of the subject. They're not mind-independent properties, even though he might want to identify them with certain mind-independent properties. So, okay, maybe that's all well and good, but you might think a naive realist account of perspectival character should appeal to mind-independent properties in the world. So maybe we can do better than Campbell's account. So there are a few challenges here for the naive realist, I think. So as I've argued, Campbell's account explains perspectival features in purely subjective terms, and maybe that's not the best route for a naive realist to go. It's also not clear how this account generalizes to non-visual modalities. So presumably something similar to the visual singling out is going on in audition or touch. But if we take the case of audition, for example, auditory objects are singled out using a whole host of different properties, not just spatial location, or not even primarily spatial location, but the frequency content, the timing, similarity in how they evolve over time. So there's a whole story about how auditory scenes are processed and how we single out objects. So we can't easily apply the spatial analogy that, or we can't easily apply the spatial processing that goes on in vision to audition and to other sense modalities. So presumably something analogous is going on here, but it's going to be a very complicated set of properties that allow us to single out an auditory object. And the worry here is that if we say, well, the mode of presentation of an auditory object is just all of that processing, the features that are being processed, then we end up accounting for the phenomenal character of auditory experience in terms of something purely subjective. So the naive realist account of external, how external features constitute experience just kind of drops out of the picture. And we end up saying that mode of presentation and phenomenal character is just a bunch of neural processing, or is something like a representational state of the subject. And that's precisely the account that Campbell wants to argue against. So there's a kind of screening off objection or worry here that the explanation privileges aspects of the subject instead of appealing to the mind-independent objects and features that we're experiencing. And that's not what you want to do if you're a naive realist. Okay, so there are some challenges there. Again, maybe this can be resolved, and this is what I want to do now is to sketch out one way in which you could go as a naive realist to give a simpler and more intuitive account of perspectival phenomena and how they enter into experience. Okay, so this is the view I call perspectival realism. So this appeals to the idea that when we perceive objects, we perceive them in different ways, as we saw in that Schellenberg quote at the beginning. So this is something which has been part of naive realism since the very early days in early Mike Martin papers, and is expanded on by a recent paper by French and Phillips. So they talk about perceiving elements in different ways. So we can have the same presented element, but we perceive it in a different way. And these ways shape the phenomenal character of experience. So remember, the claim of naive realism was that external objects and their properties are partially constitutive of experience. And French, Phillips, and Martin want to say, well, ways of experiencing are also partially constitutive. So they also shape the phenomenal character of experience. So to go back to our simple example, here's our perceptual subject perceiving a bunch of presented elements. So we've got a table which has a shape and a color, and so on. The subject is perceptually acquainted with those elements, so they're directly perceiving those things in the world. But that perceptual relation is shaped by the way that they're perceiving it. And the part of the way that they're perceiving it is from a particular spatial perspective. They're perceiving from a particular distance, looking in a particular direction. And also, if they're seeing it, it's a visual way of perceiving as well. So they're perceiving it in a visual way from a particular location. So how does this help us explain perspectival variation? Well, what I want to argue is that at least some of these ways of perceiving, perhaps not all of them, but at least some of these ways of perceiving are just the perspectival relations which I've been talking about. So perceiving from a particular distance is a way of perceiving visually. So the view I want to recommend has two main claims. So one is realism about perspectival features. So these are mind-independent relations between the subject and elements in the world that are presented. So they're perfectly robust aspects of reality that obtain between subjects and objects. And then how do we explain how these contribute to experience? Well, the simplest explanation is just that those relations, those very mind-independent relations, are character constituting elements of experience. So they're literal constituents of the experience. And I want to identify some ways of perceiving with those mind-independent relations. So as I've said, I think those two claims are actually neutral with respect to naive realism, or at least certain kinds of representational views. So if you're a representationalist, you could say there's representational content that represents the properties of objects, the intrinsic or non-perspectival properties of objects. But there's also this phenomenal character, which is a relational matter. And the phenomenal character that arises from perspectival relations is another constituent of experience. So I think I'm not going to explore that route today, but I think that's an option for the representationalist. But in a naive realist view, how does that explain how does that explain to us what's going on in these kinds of perspectival cases? So here's again a familiar example. So our subject is seeing a cup which has a circular shape, so that there's an instance of circularity with which they're perceptually acquainted. But they're seeing it from a point of view such that it's seen in some sense elliptically. It looks like an ellipse because they're seeing it at an angle. So there's a resemblance or a similarity between the circle seen from that particular angle and ellipses when they're seen face on. So what I want to say is, well, that's a way of perceiving circularity, from a particular spatial perspective. So the spatial relation between the subject and the cup explains why it is that they see the cup elliptically, or in a way that looks like an ellipse. How does that explain it? Well, the spatial relation is such that when we look at the details of how perception works, when we sort of appeal to lower level facts about the way light is reflected from the object, the way the perceiver's visual system works, and so on, the spatial relation will instantiate a bunch of geometric properties which describe the shape of an ellipse. So there are kind of lower level properties that obtain on the basis of the spatial relation, which explain the elliptical appearance. And in fact, if the subject sees a real ellipse, then that spatial relation instantiates the very same geometrical properties as the circle seen elliptically. So that explains why seeing a real ellipse and seeing a circle from an angle look similar, why they have similar phenomenal character, because the relation instantiates geometrical properties which are common to the two. So that's not to say there is any ellipse here, so that the subject is acquainted with or presented with circularity, but in a way that gives rise to an elliptical appearance because of the geometrical relation between the subject and the object. And the idea is that for any of these perspectival phenomena, whether it's lighting, or refraction, or whatever, one could give this kind of explanation that appeals to the relation between the subject and the object. And the claim I want to make as well, the perspectival appearance just is the way in which one perceives those things. So just to be clear, I don't want here to claim that the subject is acquainted with an instance of ellipticality, because there is none here. So the idea is they're acquainted with the cup, they're perceptually presented with circularity, but they're perceptually presented in a certain way that gives rise to the elliptical appearance. So you can think of the way of perceiving as a modification of the perceptual relation. It's a sort of qualification or adverbial manner of perceiving, which modifies the perceptual relation. So on this account, the phenomenal character of experience is constitutively comprised of external things like the cup, the circularity, but also the spatial perspective and the lighting conditions. They're all constituents of phenomenal character. Ellipticality shows up because it's a product of the way in which the subject is acquainted with the external object and its properties, even though there's no actual ellipse. And then there can be other subjective factors or aspects of the perceiver's point of view which also affect phenomenal character. So this isn't supposed to be exhaustive. I just want to capture a range of phenomenon that can be explained in this relational way. So in particular on this view, there is, it turns out, a very tight relationship between circularity and there's a very tight relationship between the perspectival and non-perspectival features, such that we can explain why circles seen from a certain angle look elliptical. Why do they look elliptical? Well, this is a function of the perceiver's relation to them. And in particular, this doesn't somehow come between the subject and the object, because they are acquainted perceptually with an instance of the shape. So the subject is related to the non-perspectival shape, is related to the circle by seeing it perspectively. So the idea isn't that we're acquainted with relational properties or anything like that. The idea is we're acquainted with the intrinsic shape, the non-perspectival shape, but in a manner that explains its elliptical appearance, because we see one in virtue of the other. So there is this very tight relationship between perspectival and non-perspectival properties that explains why we never get one without the other. Okay, I think I've been talking a bit long, so I'm going to skip my next slide and just go to the summary, which is perspectival features, I've argued, are mind-independent relations that can be thought of, at least on a naive realist account, as modifications of the perceptual relation. So the ways in which we perceive rather than objects or properties that we perceive. This, I think, helps us explain both the subjective similarity between certain perspectival and non-perspectival properties that explains why circles seen from an angle look elliptical in virtue of instantiating certain geometrical relations, but also explains the phenomenological difference, why we experience some properties as being perspectival and others as non-perspectival on the naive realist account or the perspectival realist account that I've offered. That's explained by a difference in the roles that those properties are playing in experience. So it's a metaphysical difference in the way that those features show up in experience, which explains a phenomenological difference in the way those properties are experienced. The simplest explanation for how these contribute to experience is just that those ways of perceiving are constituents of the resulting phenomenal character. So as well as the properties of external objects, the relation to the object is also a constituent of the character of experience. So this gives us a very, I think, intuitive account of what's happening in the case of perspectival variation. When you see the table from different distances, we don't explain the change in phenomenal character by appealing to changes in the object, but neither do we explain it by changes in the subject. We explain it by changes in the relationship between the two. And I think that's a very natural and obvious way of saying what's going on in cases of perspectival variation. So the view, I think, is a very non-revisionary and intuitive extension to conventional naive realism, but it broadens out the constitutive claim to relational features of experience that give rise to all these perspectival phenomena. So that's everything I had to say. Thanks very much for listening, and thanks to the Receiving Representations Project, which funds my research at Oslo. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Keith, for this really interesting talk, very inspiring. I think we can start the Q&A session. We have a question from Alberto.
Thank you very much, Keith. It was very